My name is Naomi Keller. I'm 35 years old and I work as a palliative care nurse in Cleveland. I have spent years standing beside strangers in the final hours of their lives, helping families say goodbye, documenting pain levels, medications, time of death, last wishes. I thought that kind of work had prepared me for anything. I was wrong, because on February 18th, 2025, at exactly 9:51 p.m., my grandmother, Margaret Keller, died during emergency surgery while I sat alone in a hospital waiting room with a paper cup of cold coffee in my hand and my phone face up beside me. I had called my parents 3 times. I had texted them updates. I had told them it was critical. I had told them she might not survive. Neither of them came. 18 minutes after my first call, my father, Richard, finally sent a message. Not a phone call, not a question, not even a lie good enough to sound human. He wrote, "If she's really dying, then we'll come." I stared at that text until the words stopped looking real. And then, less than 5 hours later, she was gone. But that wasn't the part that destroyed everything. The real shock came a week later at my grandmother's funeral, when the pastor paused in the middle of the service, reached beneath the pulpit, and pulled out a sealed envelope with her handwriting on the front. Then he looked directly at my father. The church went silent. And he said, carefully, slowly, like every word had weight, "Margaret left instructions. If Richard Keller is present, he is not to speak for her." My father went pale. My mother froze. And in that moment, I realized something horrifying. They thought they were arriving to bury a frail old woman. They had no idea she had spent months preparing to expose them, and they definitely had no idea that I had documented everything. So let me ask you something. If the person who raised you was fighting for their life, would you show up, or would you wait to see if it was worth it? Because what happened next wasn't just about loss, it was about truth, evidence, and a plan my grandmother had been building for years. If you've ever felt abandoned when it mattered most, or you believe that showing up is the bare minimum of love, subscribe to the channel right now and stay with me until the end, because the next part will make you question everything you think you know about family. The call came at 4:32 p.m. on a Thursday, one of those gray in-between hours where a shift is ending, but your mind hasn't quite let go yet. I was sitting in the break room at the hospice center, still in my scrubs, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of me. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Someone had left a half-eaten granola bar on the table. It was ordinary, quiet, predictable. And then my phone rang. The number flashed across the screen. Cleveland General Hospital. Immediately, something inside me shifted. After more than a decade working in end-of-life care, you learn to recognize patterns, tone, timing, silence. Hospitals don't call you at that hour unless something has already gone very wrong. I answered before the second ring. "Naomi Keller speaking." There was a brief pause, then a voice, professional, controlled. "Ms. Keller, this is Dr. Patel from Cleveland General. Your grandmother, Margaret Keller, was brought in by ambulance about 20 minutes ago." My grip tightened around the phone. "She has a severe bowel obstruction that has progressed into sepsis. We are preparing to take her into emergency surgery within the hour." The words landed one by one, heavy, clinical, irreversible. "Given her age and the infection, I need you to understand this is extremely high risk. There is a significant chance she may not survive the procedure." For a second, I didn't speak. Then, instinct took over. I reached for a napkin under my coffee and grabbed a pen from my bag. My hand moved automatically, writing down the key terms. Bowel obstruction, sepsis, emergency surgery, high risk. I didn't need to write it. I understood every implication of those words better than most people ever would, but writing gave me something to hold on to, a structure. A sense of control in a moment that had none. "I'm coming," I said, steadying my voice. 15 minutes. "Is there anyone else you need me to contact?" There was a pause on the other end. "Family should be notified as soon as possible." "I'll call them," I replied. And then I hung up. Immediately, I dialed my father. 1 ring, 2, 3, 4, voicemail. I didn't leave a message. Instead, I called my mother. 1 ring, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, voicemail again. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at the screen like it might explain something that didn't make sense. A medical emergency, a life-threatening surgery, and neither of them picked up. For a moment, I told myself it was timing. Maybe they were driving. Maybe they hadn't heard it. So I opened our family group chat, the one my mother had insisted on creating last year, with the caption, "We need to stay connected." My fingers moved quickly across the screen. "Grandma is in emergency surgery, Cleveland General. It's critical. You need to come now." I hit send. 4:51 p.m. The message delivered instantly. And then, within seconds, seen by Richard, seen by Susan. I waited. 5 seconds. 10, 30, nothing. No reply, no call, not even a typing bubble. The silence felt louder than anything they could have said. Still, I grabbed my coat, my bag, nearly knocking over the coffee I hadn't touched, and rushed out of the break room. The walk to my car was a blur. The sky had darkened slightly, the air colder than it had been an hour before. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and tossed my phone onto the passenger side, screen facing up, waiting. Always waiting. The hospital was 14 minutes away. I knew the route by heart. I'd driven it countless times for patients, for emergencies, for long nights that blurred into early mornings. But this time felt different. Every red light lasted too long. Every car in front of me moved too slowly, and my eyes kept flicking back to the phone, waiting for it to light up, waiting for my father's name to appear, waiting for my mother to finally call back, anything. At 5:02 p.m., it finally buzzed. My heart jumped. I reached over, grabbed the phone, already preparing what I would say, but it wasn't a call. It was a text from my father. I opened it and read, "If she's really dying, then we'll come." For a second, I thought I'd misread it. I read it again, then again. The words didn't change. Behind me, a car honked loudly. The light had turned green. I didn't move. Not immediately. Because in that moment, something inside me shifted. Quietly, but permanently. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't bad timing. This was a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice to wait, to measure, to decide if her life was urgent enough to matter. I pressed the gas and drove forward, but the silence in the car felt heavier now. Colder. Final. And as the hospital came into view in the distance, one thought kept repeating in my mind, over and over again. Not what if she doesn't survive, but something far worse. What kind of son waits to see if his mother dies before deciding to show up? I parked on level 3 of the hospital garage, space C17, and for a brief second, I sat there with both hands still gripping the steering wheel. The engine was off, but my heart hadn't caught up yet. Then, almost automatically, I reached for my phone and took a picture of the parking sign, Level 3, C17. I didn't want to forget where I was. I didn't want to lose control of even the smallest detail, because everything else already felt like it was slipping. I stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting my face harder than I expected, and walked quickly toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft, mechanical hum. And just like that, I was back in a world I knew too well. Sterile floors, fluorescent lights, the faint smell of antiseptic, and something else underneath it, something heavier. The ICU check-in desk was directly ahead. A nurse with a badge that read, Lindsay looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" "My grandmother, Margaret Keller, she was brought in about an hour ago. Emergency surgery." She typed quickly, eyes scanning the screen, then nodded. "Yes, she's being prepped now. You can wait in the family room. Let me get you a visitor badge." She printed it out and handed it to me. Visitor, a 2047. The number felt oddly significant, like a record already being written. Then she asked, gently, "Will anyone else be joining you?" There was a split second, just a breath, where I could have told the truth, that I had called, that they had seen my messages, that they had chosen not to come. But instead, I heard myself say, "They're on their way." The lie came out so easily it scared me. Maybe because admitting the truth out loud would have made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. Lindsay gave a small, reassuring smile and gestured down the hallway. Family waiting room is just past those doors. I nodded and walked on. The room was painted a dull shade of blue, the kind meant to feel calming but somehow made everything feel more distant instead. There were 8 chairs arranged in rows, a vending machine humming softly in the corner, and a wide window overlooking the parking garage I had just left. 9 other people were already there, an elderly man asleep with his chin against his chest, a woman knitting slowly, methodically, 2 young men whispering to each other in low voices. Life paused, suspended in uncertainty. I chose a seat near the hallway doors, chair D4. Positioned so I could see anyone who walked out from the operating rooms. At 6:08 p.m., they wheeled my grandmother past. It happened quickly. A glimpse of her face, pale under the harsh lights. Tubes, monitors, movement, and then she was gone behind the double doors. A nurse paused briefly and said, "A surgery will take between 2 to 4 hours." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. Then, as soon as she walked away, I reached for my phone again. "She's in surgery, sent at 6:12 p.m., delivered. Seen at 6:13 p.m., no reply. Minutes stretched, then hours, and every 30 minutes, like I was filing an official report, I sent another update. Still in surgery, no news yet, surgeon hasn't come out. Waiting. Each message followed the same pattern: delivered, seen, silence. At 7:41 p.m., another nurse stepped into the room and glanced around before her eyes settled on me. "Are your family members on their way?" I hesitated for half a second, then said it again. "Yes, they should be here soon." Another lie. This one heavier than the first, because now it wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about maintaining an illusion that no longer existed. She nodded and left. A few minutes later, I stood up and walked to the vending machine. I fed in crumpled bills and pressed a button for coffee, $2.75. The cup dropped with a hollow plastic sound, and the machine filled it with something that smelled vaguely like coffee, but tasted like heat and bitterness. I took a sip anyway, burned my tongue, but I didn't put it down. I needed something in my hands, something to hold on to. "Long wait?" a voice asked softly. I turned. The woman who had been knitting was looking at me now, her needles paused mid-motion. "Almost 2 hours," I said. She nodded sympathetically. "Is your family with you?" For a moment, I considered telling her the truth, that no one was coming, that I was alone, that the people who were supposed to be here had decided I was enough. But instead, I forced a small smile. "They're coming." She returned the smile, warm and certain. "Good. No one should have to wait alone." I nodded, then stood up before my expression could break. I walked back to my chair, sat down, and stared at the floor, blinking hard, forcing everything back into place. Because if I let myself feel it, really feel it, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop. At 9 p.m., the shift changed. A new nurse, Daniel, entered the waiting room holding a clipboard. He checked the visitor log, then looked directly at me. "Still just you?" I nodded. He hesitated. "Do you want us to call anyone for you?" The question lingered in the air. For a second, I almost said yes, almost admitted that I had done everything I could, and it hadn't been enough. But instead, I shook my head. "They know," I said quietly. He studied me for a moment, then gave a small nod and moved on, and just like that, the room returned to its quiet, suspended state. Except now, the truth was undeniable. They weren't on their way. They weren't running late. They weren't caught up in something unexpected. They had made their decision hours ago, and I was still here, pretending they hadn't. At 9:47 p.m., the double doors to the operating wing swung open with a soft mechanical push, and the quiet rhythm of the waiting room shifted instantly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The woman knitting lowered her hands. Even the vending machine seemed louder in the silence. I looked up. Dr. Patel stepped through, still wearing her surgical cap, her mask pulled down beneath her chin. I had seen that expression before, too many times. In my work, I've learned that there is a specific stillness in a doctor's face when they are about to deliver the worst possible news. It isn't dramatic. It isn't rushed. It's careful, controlled, almost rehearsed. And the moment I saw it, I already knew. Still, I stood up. Every step she took toward me felt slow, stretched, unreal. "Miss Keller," she said gently, stopping just a few feet away, "I'm so sorry." The words landed exactly where I expected them to. We did everything we could, but her heart couldn't tolerate the procedure. She went into cardiac arrest at 9:51 p.m., and we were unable to resuscitate her. For a second, the world narrowed into something quiet and distant, not empty, just muted. I heard myself speak, even though it didn't feel like my voice. Was she in pain? Dr. Patel shook her head softly. She was under anesthesia the entire time. She didn't suffer. I nodded. That answer mattered more than anything else in that moment. "Thank you," I said. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because I needed to close the exchange. Maybe because gratitude was the only structure I could still follow. A nurse approached and asked if I wanted to see her. I nodded again. They led me down a quiet hallway, away from the waiting room, away from the people who still didn't know what I had just heard. The room they brought me into was small, softly lit, almost deliberately gentle, in a way that contrasted with the reality it held. My grandmother lay there still, smaller than I remembered. Her face was calm. Her hands rested at her sides, the faint warmth of her skin still lingering when I reached out and touched them. I pulled a chair closer and sat down beside her. For a moment, I didn't speak, because everything that needed to be said suddenly felt too big and too late. Then, quietly, I leaned in. "I'm here," I whispered. I stayed. The words caught in my throat, but I forced them out. "I won't let them rewrite this, I promise." I don't know how long I sat there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. Time had stopped meaning anything. Eventually, I stood up. I adjusted the blanket slightly, smoothing it the way I had done for hundreds of patients before. The familiarity of the gesture felt strange, comforting and painful at the same time. Then I turned and walked out. No one stopped me. No one said anything. The hallway felt longer on the way back. When I reached the elevators, I didn't get in right away. Instead, I sat down on a bench nearby, my body finally registering the weight of everything that had just happened. And then, almost automatically, I reached for my phone. There was one call I still had to make. I dialed my father. 1 ring, 2, 3. He picked up on the third. "Yeah?" No greeting, no concern. "Dad," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. "Grandma didn't make it. She died in surgery." There was a pause. Not long. 3 seconds maybe. Then he said, flatly, "Okay." I waited. For anything else. A question. A reaction. A pause that meant something. Nothing came. "We'll figure out the arrangements tomorrow," he added. That was it. I felt something inside me tighten. "That's all?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "That's all you're going to say?" "What do you want me to say, Naomi?" he replied, his tone already edged with irritation. "She's gone." "I want you to say you're sorry you didn't come," I said, my voice shaking now despite my effort to keep it steady. "I want you to ask if I'm okay." There was a brief silence. Then he exhaled. "You're fine," he said. "You work with dying people. This is what you do." The words hit harder than anything else that night. Not loud, not angry, just dismissive. Like my grief was part of my job description. And before I could respond, the line went dead. Call duration, 46 seconds. I stared at the screen. Then, instinctively, I took a screenshot. Because even in that moment, some part of me was already documenting, already preserving, already preparing. I swallowed hard, then dialed my mother. She picked up on the second ring. In the background, I could hear the television. "Hello?" "Mom," I said. "Grandma died. She didn't survive the surgery." There was a pause. Then she said, almost casually, "Oh, well, I suppose that's for the best. She was suffering." I closed my eyes. "She wasn't suffering," I said. "It was sudden." "Well," she replied, At her age—" Her voice trailed off, like the explanation didn't need to be finished. "Are you coming to the hospital?" I asked. "What for?" she said, genuinely confused. "She's already gone, isn't she?" The question hung there, hollow and final. I didn't answer. "Your father will take care of everything," she added, as if that settled it. Then she hung up. I sat there on that bench, my phone still in my hand, the noise of the hospital moving around me like nothing had changed. But everything had. I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't scream. I didn't break down. Instead, I sat there for 20 minutes, completely still, letting the reality settle into something solid. Then, slowly, I stood up, walked to the parking garage, found my car, level 3, C17, exactly where I had left it. I got in, closed the door, and rested my hands in my lap. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to think clearly. Not about the loss, not about the grief, but about what had just been revealed. Because this wasn't just about absence. It wasn't just about missed calls or delayed reactions. This was something else, something colder, something deliberate. And as I sat there in the dark, one thought became impossible to ignore. They hadn't just failed to show up. They had chosen not to. The next morning, my phone rang at exactly 9 a.m. I hadn't slept, not really. I had gone through the motions, sat at my kitchen table, made a list, replayed the timeline in my head over and over again, but sleep never came. By the time the sun rose, everything felt sharper, colder, clearer. So when my father's name lit up on the screen, I already knew what the call was going to be about. I answered. "Naomi," he said, his voice steady, businesslike, as if we were discussing something routine. "I've contacted a funeral home, Carter and Sons. They can take care of everything. You should go in today and handle the arrangements." I blinked. "You want me to do it?" "Well," he replied, almost impatiently, "you're already off work, aren't you?" "I'm not off work," I said quietly. "I took emergency leave." There was a brief pause, then a sigh. "Naomi, you're a nurse. You understand how these things work. It'll be easier if you just take care of it." The words settled heavily in the space between us. I'm a nurse, not a daughter, not a granddaughter, a function, a role. "I work in palliative care," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "That's not the same as arranging a funeral." Another pause, then flatly, "Just handle it. We trust you." "We trust you." Not "are you okay?" Not "do you need help?" Just an assignment. "I'll take care of it," I said finally, because arguing wouldn't change anything. Because at this point, I understood something I hadn't fully admitted the night before. If I didn't do it, no one else would. That afternoon, I drove to Carter and Sons funeral home. The building was older, quiet, with dark wood panels and a kind of stillness that felt different from the hospital. Less urgent, more final. Inside, a man in his early 60s stood behind the desk. Silver hair, soft expression. His name tag read, Michael Carter. "Ms. Keller?" he asked gently. I nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss." It was the first time anyone had said those words to me without expectation, without distance. "Thank you," I replied. He guided me into his office, a small room with neatly arranged folders and a framed photograph of what I assumed was his own family. We sat down, and then the process began. Casket selection, service details, burial or cremation, music, readings, timing. Each question felt surreal, like I was filling out paperwork for someone else's life. At one point, he paused, pen hovering slightly above the page. "Will your parents be involved in the planning?" he asked. The question lingered. I looked down at the table. "My father said I should handle it," I answered. Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set his pen down slowly and leaned back just a fraction, studying me. Not intrusively, but carefully. "That's not the same as being supported," he said quietly. The words landed harder than I expected. I didn't reply, because there was nothing to argue with. We continued, and then, near the end of the meeting, as he flipped through a different folder, he said something that made everything inside me go still. "Your grandmother actually came in 2 weeks ago," he said. I looked up. "She did?" He nodded. "Yes, she prearranged quite a few details. The casket, the hymns, even some specific instructions for the service. A cold sensation spread through my chest. She knew? I asked. I wouldn't say she knew, he replied carefully, but she was very prepared. He reached into the folder and pulled out a set of documents. Additionally, he continued, she left 2 sealed envelopes. My breath caught. One was given to Pastor Reynolds at St. Mark's Church, he said. The other was left with her attorney. I stared at him. Did she say what was in them? Michael shook his head. No, only that they were to be opened under specific conditions. She was very clear about that. Specific conditions. The phrase echoed in my mind. This wasn't fear. This wasn't just preparation. This was intention, a plan. I left the funeral home with a folder in my hands and a weight in my chest that felt different from grief. Heavier, sharper. Because now there was a question I couldn't ignore. What exactly had my grandmother been preparing for? Over the next 2 days, everything moved forward. Calls were made, dates were set. The service was scheduled, and on the surface, everything looked normal. But underneath, something had shifted. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's message again. If she's really dying, then we'll come. I replayed it, over and over. Then I started counting. 11 missed calls, 8 messages during surgery, 1 response, no visits, no follow-up, no regret. By the 3rd night, I stopped trying to rest. Instead, I opened my phone and started organizing. Screenshots, call logs, message timestamps. I didn't know why I was doing it, not yet, but I couldn't stop. And then, on the morning of the 3rd day, I went to my grandmother's house. The air inside felt still, untouched. Her chair was exactly where she had left it. A book rested on the side table. A pair of reading glasses lay folded beside it. Everything looked like she might walk back in at any moment. I moved slowly through the space, my footsteps quieter than usual, as if I was afraid to disturb something. I went into the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. A manila envelope, placed neatly in the center of the table. My name written across the front in her handwriting. Naomi. My heart started to pound. I stepped closer. There was a smaller line beneath it. Open if I don't come home. For a moment, I just stood there, staring, because suddenly, everything made sense. The funeral arrangements, the sealed envelopes, the precision, the timing. This wasn't something she had done out of fear. This was something she had done out of certainty. She had known exactly how this would unfold. Slowly, I pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, the same table where we had shared coffee, where she had told stories, where everything had always felt simple. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several photocopied documents, and a small USB drive. I stared at them for a long time before touching anything. Because deep down, I already understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever was inside that envelope was going to change everything I thought I knew about my family. I sat at my grandmother's kitchen table for a long time before I touched anything inside the envelope. The room was quiet, too quiet. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking time as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The air still carried the faint scent of lavender and something warm, familiar. Something that made it feel like she had only just stepped out and might come back at any moment. She wouldn't. And whatever she had left for me, she had meant for me to see it now. Slowly, I unfolded the letter. The paper was cream-colored, the handwriting steady and unmistakably hers. Naomi, if you're reading this, then I didn't come home. My chest tightened. I forced myself to keep going. She wrote that she didn't expect my father to come to the hospital, that she had already made peace with that truth long before this moment, that she had spoken directly to Dr. Patel and signed the necessary forms to ensure that only I would be contacted if her condition became critical. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't circumstance. It was a decision. And suddenly, the events of that night shifted in my mind, not as something that had gone wrong, but as something that had unfolded exactly the way she knew it would. You've always been the one who stayed, she wrote. When I was lonely, you came. When I was afraid, you sat with me. You didn't rush. You didn't look at the clock. You just stayed. My vision blurred for a moment, but I didn't stop reading, because then the letter changed. The tone sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity. I need you to understand something about your father. I felt my grip tighten on the paper. She told me about 2017, the year she had her stroke. 6 days in acute care, 6 weeks in rehabilitation. A long, difficult recovery, learning to walk again, to speak clearly again, to regain the pieces of herself that had been taken from her without warning. And during that entire time, my father had visited her once. 15 minutes. And 12 of those minutes, she wrote, had been spent asking if she had considered selling the house. I stopped reading. My hands went still against the table, because I remembered that time. I remembered calling, asking how she was doing, and being told, "She's fine. We've got it handled. You don't need to worry." I had believed him. Every word. Slowly, I lowered the letter and looked at the documents beneath it. Hospital records. Photocopied visitor logs. I picked one up. Allegheny Rehabilitation Center, October to November 2017. My eyes scanned the names. Naomi Keller, multiple visits. Richard Keller, 1 visit, 11:02 a.m. to 11:17 a.m. Susan Keller, no visits recorded, 15 minutes. That was all he had given her. I swallowed hard and reached for the USB drive. For a second, I hesitated, because something inside me already knew. This wasn't just going to confirm what I had read. It was going to make it undeniable. I stood up, walked into the living room, and plugged the drive into my laptop. 7 files appeared on the screen, each one labeled with a date. Each one a voicemail. I clicked the first. A familiar voice filled the room. "Hey, Mom, it's me. I know you're in rehab, but I've been thinking, have you considered selling the house? It might be easier for you now." I froze. No greeting. No, "How are you feeling?" No, "Are you okay?" Just the house. The message ended after 38 seconds. I clicked the next file. Another voicemail. Another request. Another casual tone like nothing had happened. "Mom, I talked to a realtor. You could probably get a good price." Then another and another. By the 4th message, my stomach had turned. Because the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every call had a purpose. Every conversation had a transaction. And none of them had anything to do with her. I reached for the final set of documents. Bank statements, highlighted lines, dates circled in pen. March 2019. Withdrawal, $3,200. A note in my grandmother's handwriting beside it. Asked March 10th. Promised to repay soon. Another page. 2022. Withdrawal, $1,800. Another note. Second time. Still hasn't repaid first. I stared at the numbers, then at the handwriting, then back at the screen. And something inside me broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I pushed the chair back, stood up abruptly, and paced across the room. "You asked her for money?" I said out loud, my voice shaking. "While she was in rehab? While she was learning to walk again?" The silence answered me. I turned back to the table, hands clenched. "You didn't visit her. You didn't call her. Unless you needed something?" The truth settled in piece by piece until it formed something solid, something undeniable. He hadn't just been absent. He had been present only when it benefited him. Slowly, I sat back down. The anger didn't disappear, but it changed. It sharpened, focused. I opened my laptop again, pulled up a blank spreadsheet, and began typing. Evidence log, Richard Keller, 2017, stroke recovery. 1 hospital visit. 15 minutes, multiple voicemails discussing house sale, 2019 to 2022. Financial requests, $5,000 borrowed. No repayment, January 2025. Emergency surgery, 11 unanswered calls, 8 ignored messages, 1 response. If she's really dying, then we'll come. 0 hospital visits. I stopped for a moment and looked at what I had written. Then I saved the file. Because now, for the first time since that night, I understood what my grandmother had been doing. She hadn't just been remembering, She hadn't just been documenting. She had been building something, a record, a defense, a truth that couldn't be rewritten. And now, she had passed it to me. I closed the laptop slowly, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen. I won't let this go, I said quietly, not to the room, not to the silence, but to her. Because this wasn't just about what had happened. This was about what had been hidden for years. And for the first time, I wasn't just grieving, I was preparing. The more I looked at the evidence, the harder it became to see my father as the person I thought I knew. At first, it was just fragments. A voicemail here, a bank statement there, a note written in the margin of a document. But as I sat at that table, surrounded by everything my grandmother had preserved, those fragments began to connect. And once they did, there was no way to unsee it. I went back to the laptop and replayed the voicemails, this time not as isolated moments, but as part of a pattern. The tone was always the same, casual, efficient, detached. Hey, Mom, a quick question about the house. Just wanted to check if you've thought about selling. Can you help me out with something? I'll pay you back soon. No pauses to listen. No concern. No warmth. Each message felt less like a conversation and more like a transaction. I started writing everything down, not just dates and amounts, but context. What had happened to my grandmother at the time, where she was, what she was going through. 2017. Stroke recovery, learning to walk again, dependent on others for basic movement, and during that time, requests about real estate. 2019, stable but aging, living alone, managing her own finances, and during that time, requests for money. 2022, health declining, more frequent doctor visits, and during that time, more requests, more promises, no repayment. The pattern wasn't occasional. It was consistent, predictable, intentional. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, trying to find a version of this that made sense in a different way. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a gap I hadn't seen. But there wasn't one, because every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. He didn't reach out because he cared. He reached out because he needed something, and when there was nothing left to take, he didn't show up at all. My hands tightened into fists. I closed my eyes for a moment, but the words came back anyway. If she's really dying, then we'll come. It wasn't just a cruel sentence. It was a summary, a final confirmation of everything that had been happening for years. Slowly, I opened my eyes again. The anger didn't feel chaotic anymore. It felt structured, clear. I turned back to the spreadsheet and began organizing everything into a timeline. Not for emotion, not for memory, for evidence. Every voicemail was labeled and transcribed. Every financial transaction was matched with a note. Every hospital record was cross-referenced with visitor logs. And then I added the final section, January 2025, emergency surgery. I typed carefully, 11 unanswered calls, 8 messages sent during procedure, read within minutes, no response. 1 reply, if she's really dying, then we'll come. 0 visits. I stared at that last line for a long time. 0 visits, not late, not delayed. 0. That was the truth. Not complicated, not emotional, just absolute. I saved the document again. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I printed it. The paper slid out slowly, each page carrying more weight than it should have. I picked them up, flipping through them one by one. What I was holding wasn't just a record. It was a narrative, a story told entirely through actions, through absence, through what hadn't been done. I set the pages down on the table and exhaled slowly, because now I understood something my grandmother had known long before I did. Truth by itself isn't enough. It has to be shown, proven, structured in a way that no one can dismiss or rewrite. And that's exactly what she had been preparing. Not a confrontation, not an argument, a case. I looked around the room again, at the chair she used to sit in, at the window where she watched the afternoon light, at the small details that made this place feel like her. She knew, I whispered, not just that she might die, but how people would behave when she did. and she had chosen not to leave that to chance. I picked up the stack of papers again, aligning the edges carefully. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about anger anymore. It was about clarity, about making sure that when the time came, no one could stand in a room, tell a different version of events, and be believed, because the truth would already be there, documented, dated, undeniable. I walked over to my bag and placed the documents inside, along with the USB drive and the letter. Then I paused, because something had shifted again, not in what I knew, but in what I was going to do with it. Up until that moment, everything had been internal, discovery, realization, understanding. But now, for the first time, I was thinking ahead. To the funeral, to the people who would be there, to the version of my grandmother's life that would be presented, and more importantly, to who would be speaking for her. My grip tightened slightly on the strap of my bag, because one thing was certain now. If anyone stood up and tried to rewrite her story, to soften it, to clean it up, to make it more comfortable, I wouldn't let them. Not this time. Not after everything she had left behind. Not after everything she had trusted me with. I turned off the lights, stepped out of the house, and closed the door behind me. And as I walked toward my car, one thought stayed with me, steady and unshakable. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something else. Something my grandmother had started, and now I was going to finish. The funeral was held on February 25th at St. Mark's Church, a place my grandmother had attended for over 30 years. I arrived early, before most people had taken their seats, before the quiet murmurs of conversation filled the room. I needed that silence. I needed a few minutes to stand there alone and prepare myself for what was coming, because by then I already knew this wouldn't be a normal service. By the time the pews filled, more than 60 people had signed the guest book. Neighbors, members of the church, people who had known my grandmother not just as a name, but as a presence, someone who showed up, who listened, who stayed. At 10:28 a.m., my parents arrived, right on time. My mother wore navy, pearls at her neck, her posture perfect. My father walked beside her in a black suit, one hand lightly resting on her elbow as if guiding her forward. Their expressions were composed, controlled grief, practiced and measured. They took their seats in the front row. I sat 3 rows behind them, and for a moment I simply watched. The contrast was impossible to ignore. They hadn't been there when it mattered, but they were here now, when people were watching. The service began at 10:30. Pastor Reynolds stepped up to the pulpit and delivered the eulogy. 8 minutes. Calm, respectful, filled with familiar details, her faith, her garden, her kindness, her devotion to family. At one point, my father lifted a handkerchief to his eyes. From where I sat, I couldn't see tears, only the motion, only the performance. And for a brief second, I wondered, if I hadn't known what I knew, would I have believed it? Would anyone? The eulogy came to an end. There was a pause, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the air. Then Pastor Reynolds looked down at the podium, reached beneath it and pulled out an envelope. Sealed, cream-colored, my grandmother's handwriting on the front. The room went still. "There is one more thing," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something different in it now, something deliberate. This was left to me by Margaret 6 days before her surgery, with instructions that it be handled in a very specific way. I felt my heart begin to pound. He turned the envelope slightly, reading from the front. Then he looked up, directly at my father, and said slowly, "If Richard Keller is present, he is not to speak on her behalf." The words landed like a fracture through the room. Silence followed, heavy, immediate. My father's face changed. Color drained from it in an instant, the composure cracking just enough to reveal something underneath. Shock, disbelief, something closer to fear. My mother leaned slightly toward him, whispering something I couldn't hear, but he didn't respond. He was staring straight ahead. Pastor Reynolds stepped down from the pulpit and walked toward me. Every eye in the room followed him. When he reached my row, he extended the envelope. "She asked that this be given to you privately," he said. I stood, my movement slower than I intended, and took it from his hands. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, sharp and strained. "That's my mother. I have a right to see that." Pastor Reynolds didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply turned his head slightly and said, "Your mother's wishes were very clear, Richard." And then he walked back to the front of the church. No further explanation, no discussion, just finality. I didn't look back. Instead, I turned and walked out of the sanctuary, down the hallway and into the nearest restroom. I locked the door behind me, stepped into the first stall, and sat down. For a moment, I just held the envelope in my hands, feeling the weight of it, knowing that whatever was inside had been meant for this exact moment. Then, slowly, I broke the seal. Inside was a 2-page letter, same cream paper, same steady handwriting. I unfolded it and began to read. "Naomi, if you're reading this, then I'm gone." And Richard showed up to my funeral. My breath caught. She had known, not guessed. Known. "I knew he wouldn't come to the hospital," she wrote. "He never does, not when it costs him something." The words were precise, measured, not emotional, just true. She went on to repeat what I had already discovered, but hearing it in her voice, written in her hand, made it different, more final. In 2017, when I had my stroke, he visited once, 15 minutes. 12 of those minutes were spent asking about selling the house. I swallowed hard. She listed the money, the dates, the calls, the pattern, everything I had documented, everything she had preserved. And then, she said the thing I didn't know I needed to hear. "You stayed." The words blurred as my eyes filled. "You didn't come when it was convenient. You came when it mattered. You are the daughter I needed." My chest tightened. Because in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't just about exposing him. It was about affirming me, about correcting something that had been wrong for a long time. Then came the part that changed everything. "The house is yours," she wrote. "The will is filed. Copies are with Pastor Reynolds and my attorney." I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. But she wasn't finished. "Richard will be angry. He will say I was confused, that you influenced me. Let him." I could almost hear her voice, calm, certain. "You have the records, the logs, the truth." And then, at the very end, he wanted what I owned, not who I was. I stopped reading, because that sentence didn't just explain him. It explained everything. I folded the letter carefully and sat there for a moment, breathing, letting it settle. Then I stood, unlocked the door, and walked back into the hallway. The service was still ongoing, voices low, controlled, normal. But I wasn't the same person who had walked out, because now I wasn't just carrying grief, I was carrying proof. And as I stepped back into the sanctuary, my eyes found my father immediately. He didn't look at me, but I could see it in the way he sat, stiff, unmoving. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. And for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel uncertain. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt something else, something sharper, something steady, clarity. Because whatever happened next, this wasn't going to be their version of the story. Not anymore. That evening, the house filled slowly. It was a tradition my grandmother had kept for years. After every funeral, there would be a small gathering, coffee on the stove, plates of food on the table, people standing in quiet clusters, sharing stories, offering comfort, trying to turn loss into something that felt communal. By 3:30 p.m., nearly 20 people had arrived, neighbors, members of the church, a few distant relatives I barely recognized. The living room felt smaller than usual, the air heavier, filled with soft voices and careful laughter that never quite reached the surface. I stood near the center of it all, the letter folded in my hands, feeling the weight of it more with each passing minute, because I knew what was coming. And I knew once it started, there was no going back. My parents arrived last. Of course they did. They stepped through the front door with the same controlled composure they had worn at the church. My mother gave a small, polite smile to the room. My father nodded to a few people, his expression measured, as if he were stepping into a role he had already rehearsed. For a moment, no one said anything. Then conversations resumed, normal, surface level, safe. But beneath it, something had shifted. People had heard what happened at the church. They had seen the envelope. They had heard the line. And even if they didn't know the full story, they knew enough to feel the tension. I took a breath, stepped forward, and spoke. "I have something Grandma wanted everyone here to hear." The room quieted almost immediately. Not completely, but enough. My father turned toward me, his expression tightening. "Naomi," he said sharply, "this isn't the time." His voice carried just enough authority to suggest control, but not enough to command it. Before I could respond, another voice cut through the space. "Actually," Pastor Reynolds said calmly from near the fireplace, "this is exactly the time." The room went still. My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak again. He sat down, and for the first time that day, he looked uncertain. I unfolded the letter. My hands were steady. My voice, surprisingly, was too. And then I began to read, not adding anything, not explaining, just reading her words exactly as she had written them. In 2017, when I had my stroke, Richard visited once, 15 minutes. A murmur rippled faintly through the room. I didn't look up. At 12 of those minutes asking about selling the house, the silence deepened. I kept the records, the visitor logs, the bank statements. I could feel the shift now. The way people were no longer just listening, they were processing, reevaluating. "He borrowed money, and never repaid it." A chair creaked somewhere behind me. "He calls once a month, always brief, always with a purpose," I continued, word by word, line by line, until I reached the part that mattered most. "He is the son I raised, but not the son I deserved." This time I paused, just for a second, long enough for it to settle into the room. Then I finished. "He wanted what I owned, not who I was." When the last word left my mouth, the silence that followed was absolute. No movement, no whisper, just stillness. I lowered the letter slowly, folded it once, then looked up, directly at my father. His face was flushed now, the controlled composure gone, replaced by something raw, anger, yes, but also something else. Exposure. "She was my mother," he said, his voice shaking despite the effort to steady it. "And where were you when she was dying?" I asked. The question landed harder than anything I had read, because this time, it was mine, not hers. He didn't answer, not immediately. "We were busy," he said finally, the words sounding weaker the moment they left his mouth. "You were already there." The room reacted, not loudly, but noticeably. A shift, a discomfort, because everyone understood what that meant. I took a step closer. "She asked the hospital not to call you," I said. That got his attention. His eyes snapped toward me. "What?" "She signed the paperwork herself," I continued. "She didn't want to spend her last moments waiting for you to care." The words didn't rise in volume. They didn't need to. They carried on their own. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and held it up. "You texted me," I said. "Do you remember what you said?" He didn't respond, so I read it, out loud. "If she's really dying, then we'll come." "Jessie." The room reacted again, this time louder. A sharp intake of breath. A whispered, "Oh my God." My father stood abruptly. "That's taken out of context," he snapped. "There is no context," I replied calmly. "There's just the message." I took another step forward. "She left the house to me," I added. "The will is filed. If you want to challenge it, you can. But I have everything." I let the words hang, then finished quietly. Every call, every message, every record. His expression changed again. The anger didn't disappear, but something underneath it did. Certainty. For a moment, it looked like he might say something else. Defend himself, explain, deny. But instead, he grabbed his coat, turned, and walked out. The door closed harder than necessary behind him. My mother stood a second longer. Her eyes flicked between me and the letter in my hand. But she didn't speak. She followed him, silently. And then they were gone. The room remained still for a few seconds after that, as if no one was quite sure what to do next. Then, slowly, people began to move again. Not like before, not casually, but carefully, because something had been revealed, not just about my father, but about my grandmother, about what she had endured and what she had chosen not to stay silent about. I stood there in the center of the room, surrounded by people I barely knew, holding the letter that had just changed everything. And for the first time since the hospital, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not peace, but something close, because the truth had been spoken, out loud, in the open, where it couldn't be rewritten, and no matter what happened next, that part was done. 3 days after the gathering, I received a call from Daniel Brooks, my grandmother's attorney. His voice was calm, but there was something deliberate in the way he spoke, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "Naomi," he said, "there's something your grandmother asked me to give you." She was very specific about the timing. I stood still in my kitchen, my hand tightening slightly around the phone. "What kind of timing?" "A week after the funeral," he replied. "She wanted you to have already read the first letter before you saw this." A quiet chill moved through me. "I'll come in," I said. The next morning, I sat across from him in his office, a space lined with shelves of neatly organized files, the air faintly smelling of paper and ink. He didn't waste time. From his desk, he pulled out a small envelope, sealed, my name written across the front, Naomi. Open February 28th. He placed it gently in front of me. "She was very clear," he said. "You were to open this alone." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak, because by now I understood something about my grandmother that I hadn't fully grasped before. She hadn't just left memories. She had left steps, a sequence, and I was walking through it exactly as she intended. I went home, closed the door behind me, and sat at the same kitchen table where I had opened the first envelope. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then, slowly, I broke the seal. Inside was a folded note and a flash drive. My heart began to beat harder. I unfolded the note. "Naomi, if you're reading this, then the funeral is over, and you've seen who shows up when people are watching." I swallowed. "Now I need you to see what happens when they think no one is." My fingers tightened around the paper. "Watch this alone, then decide what to do." That was it. No explanation, no guidance, just trust. I reached for my laptop, inserted the flash drive, and opened the single file it contained. The video began. The date stamp in the corner read January 12th, 2025, 6 days before her surgery. The camera angle was fixed, slightly elevated, pointing toward the living room. At first, the room was empty. Then, after a few seconds, the front door opened, and my breath caught. My father walked in. My mother followed. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse quickening. They didn't know they were being recorded. That much was obvious. There was no performance, no careful tone, no restraint. They stood in the middle of the room, looking around casually, as if evaluating something. Then my father spoke. "She's not going to last much longer," he said. My mother shifted slightly. "Are you sure?" "Doctor said her heart's getting worse," he replied. "It's only a matter of time." I felt my stomach tighten. "So what do we do?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "We wait." The word landed like a weight. "Once she's gone," he continued, "the house is ours. I already talked to a realtor. We can list it fast. Probably get $450, maybe more if we fix a few things." I froze. Every muscle in my body locked in place. My mother hesitated. "What about Naomi?" she asked quietly. "She's here all the time." My father let out a short laugh. "Naomi's emotional," he said. "She'll be upset for a while, but she'll get over it." I stared at the screen, unable to move. "Besides," he added, "we're next of kin. It all comes to us anyway." My mother didn't answer immediately. "I don't know," she said finally. "This feels wrong." My father shook his head. "It's not wrong. It's practical," he said. "She's old. She's going to die. This is just planning ahead." Planning ahead. The words echoed in my mind, cold, detached, final. "What if something happens?" my mother asked. "What if she ends up in the hospital?" "Then Naomi handles it," he said without hesitation. "That's what she does. She's a nurse." I felt something inside me snap, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. They continued talking about repairs, about timing, about how quickly they could sell the house. And then just before they left, my father said something that settled everything into place. "We just need to show up to the funeral," he said. "Say the right things. People forget everything else." The video ended shortly after. The screen went black, and for a long time, I didn't move. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the dark monitor, trying to process what I had just seen. Because this wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't interpretation. It wasn't something that could be explained away or misunderstood. This was intention, clear, measured, documented. They hadn't just failed her. They had been waiting for her to die, so they could take what she left behind. I closed the laptop slowly. My hands were steady now, not because I wasn't angry, but because the anger had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't chaotic. It was focused, directed. I reached for my phone, dialed Daniel Brooks. He answered on the second ring. "Naomi?" "I have it," I said. There was a pause. "And?" I looked at the flash drive still sitting on the table. "They knew," I said quietly. "They were planning everything before she was even gone." Another pause. Then, calmly, "Good," he said. "Then we're ready." The words settled into place, because now, for the first time since this began, I understood the full scope of what my grandmother had done. She hadn't just left me the truth. She had given me the final piece, the one thing no one could deny, the one thing no one could argue with. Proof. And as I sat there, the silence around me no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Because whatever came next, this wasn't going to be a story told in fragments anymore. This was going to be the whole truth, from beginning to end. And this time, it wasn't going to stay hidden. 2 days later, everything moved from private truth to public consequence. It began with a formal notice at exactly 9:12 a.m., and my parents received a legal letter from Daniel Brooks' office, an official confirmation of the will, the property transfer, and a clear statement that any attempt to contest it would be met with documented evidence already on file. By 10:03 a.m., my phone rang. I knew it would. I let it ring twice before answering. "Naomi." My father's voice came through, tight, controlled, but barely holding together. "What is this?" And just like that, we were no longer pretending. "It's the will," I said calmly. "You've seen it." "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She wasn't in her right mind. You were influencing her." There it was, exactly as my grandmother predicted. I didn't interrupt him. I let him speak, because for the first time I wasn't reacting, so I was waiting. "You think you can just take everything?" he continued. "That house belongs to this family." "It does," I replied evenly. And she decided who that meant. A pause, short, sharp. "You're making a mistake," he said, lowering his voice now, shifting tactics. "We can handle this privately. There's no need to involve lawyers." I almost smiled, because that sentence said more than anything else he had said so far. "No," I answered. "There is." Silence. Then, "What do you want?" he asked. Not what is right, not what happened. "What do you want?" And in that moment, everything became crystal clear. "This isn't about what I want," I said. "It's about what she left behind." Another pause, longer this time. And then, quietly, "You don't understand how complicated this is." "I understand it perfectly," I replied. "I was there." The call ended shortly after that. No resolution, no agreement, just a line drawn. And once it was drawn, everything accelerated. By the afternoon, Daniel had already filed the necessary documents to secure the estate. The house was legally mine. The accounts were locked. Any transfer required my authorization. And more importantly, the evidence was prepared, not released, not yet, but ready. That night, I sat alone in the living room. The same room, the same walls, the same space where they had stood, talking about timelines and profits as if my grandmother's life were already over. And for a moment, I let myself feel it. Not the anger, not the betrayal, but the weight of it all. Because this wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about closing something that had been open for years. Something quiet, something unspoken, something that had shaped every interaction, every absence, every moment they chose not to show up. And now it was ending. The next morning at 8:45 a.m., Daniel called again. "They've filed a notice of intent to contest," he said. Of course they had. "They're claiming undue influence and lack of capacity." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. And we respond. Simple, direct, final. By noon, the response had been filed. Medical evaluations, signed documents, witness statements, visitor logs, bank records, and, if necessary, the video. But we didn't lead with that. We didn't need to. Not yet. Because the strategy wasn't just to win. It was to make it undeniable. By the third day, the pressure had shifted. Their calls became less aggressive. Their messages shorter, less certain. Because every step they took forward meant something solid, something documented, something they couldn't push through. And then, on the fourth day, they stopped. No new filings, no new calls, just silence. A different kind of silence than before. Not absence, not avoidance, but retreat. That afternoon, Daniel called one last time. "They're withdrawing," he said. I didn't respond immediately, because I wanted to feel it. Not the victory, not the relief, but the finality. "Is it over?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "Completely." I hung up. And for the first time since the hospital, everything was quiet. Not tense, not waiting, just still. I walked through the house slowly, past the kitchen, past the hallway, into the living room, and I sat down in the same chair my grandmother used to sit in every evening. For a moment, I just looked around, at everything she had built, everything she had protected, everything she had chosen to leave behind, not to the person who expected it, but to the person who stayed. And that was the difference. That was always the difference. Not obligation, not entitlement, but presence. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly, because this wasn't just the end of a legal battle. It was the end of something much older, something quieter, something that had lived in the spaces between conversations, in the missed calls, in the empty chairs at important moments. And now, it was done. No more waiting, no more questioning, no more wondering if things could have been different, because they had made their choices, and so had she. And now, so had I. Outside, the light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the room. I sat there a little longer, letting it settle, not rushing, not moving, just being. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to fight, only one thing left to do: move forward. And this time, I would be the one deciding what that looked like. A week later, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically. The same furniture, the same walls, the same quiet creak of the floorboards in the morning, but because the tension that had once lived inside it was gone. For the first time, it didn't feel like a place holding its breath. It felt like a place that could finally exhale. I woke up early that day, just after sunrise. The light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the living room. I made coffee the way my grandmother used to, slow, deliberate, without rushing, and carried the cup to her chair. I didn't think of it as her chair anymore. Not in a way that felt like loss, but in a way that felt like continuity. I sat down, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the mug, and looked around the room. Everything was still here, but it no longer felt like something I was holding on to. It felt like something I was stepping into. And that was the difference, because for weeks, everything had been about the past, about what was said, what wasn't said, what was done, what was avoided. Now, for the first time, it was about what came next. Later that morning, I opened the folder Daniel had given me, the final set of documents confirming the estate closure. Everything was official now. Signed, filed, complete. There were no loose ends, no unresolved claims, no lingering questions, just clarity. And yet, as I flipped through the pages, I realized something unexpected. This wasn't the part that mattered most. Not the legal victory, not the house, not even the proof. What mattered was what those things had revealed. Because somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about ownership and started being about truth. I closed the folder and set it aside. Then I stood up and walked toward the hallway. At the end of it was my grandmother's bedroom. I hadn't gone in since the day she left for surgery, not because I couldn't, but because I hadn't been ready. Now I was. I opened the door slowly. The room was exactly as she had left it, the bed neatly made, the curtains half drawn, a book resting on the nightstand, a pair of reading glasses placed carefully beside it. Nothing disturbed, nothing changed. For a moment I just stood there, not moving, not speaking, just taking it in. And then, quietly, I stepped inside. There was no overwhelming wave of grief this time, no sharp ache, no sense of collapse, just something softer, something steadier, acceptance. I walked to the dresser and ran my fingers lightly across the surface, tracing the familiar edges, the small imperfections that only someone who lived there would notice. This room wasn't frozen in time. It wasn't a shrine. It was a chapter, one that had ended, so another could begin. And that realization didn't feel heavy. It felt right. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and paused on my parents' names. For a long moment, I just looked at them, not with anger, not with resentment, but with clarity. Because whatever they were to me before, that had changed. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a quiet, irreversible one. I didn't need answers from them anymore. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need apologies. Because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed everything. And once something is fully seen, it can't be unseen. I didn't call. I didn't text. I simply locked my phone and set it down, not as an act of rejection, but as an act of closure. Because sometimes moving forward doesn't mean fixing what's broken. It means choosing not to carry it anymore. As the day moved into evening, the house filled with a different kind of silence. Not empty, not lonely, but peaceful. The kind of silence that doesn't ask anything from you, the kind that simply exists. I returned to the living room and sat down again, this time without the weight that had followed me for so long. And as I looked around, I realized something my grandmother had understood long before I did. Family isn't defined by proximity, or obligation, or even history. It's defined by presence, by who shows up, by who stays, by who chooses you, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs them something. And in the end, that's what she had chosen. Not the person who expected everything, but the person who gave without asking, the person who stayed. And now, sitting in the quiet of the home she had protected, I understood that her final gift wasn't the house. It wasn't the documents. It wasn't even the truth she had left behind. It was something much simpler, something far more lasting. She had given me permission. Permission to stop chasing people who never intended to stay. Permission to stop explaining myself to those who never tried to understand. Permission to build something different, something honest, something whole. Outside, the last light of the day faded into dusk. The sky dimmed, the shadows softened, and the world slowed just enough to feel still. I sat there a little longer, letting it all settle, because for the first time in a long time, there was no urgency, no pressure, no unfinished conversation waiting to happen. Only one quiet, certain truth. This chapter was over, and the next one was finally mine to write. This story isn't just about a will. It's about truth, presence, and the true value of family. The biggest lesson is clear. Family isn't about blood ties. Family is about those who stay when you need them most. The father in the story is there in name, but the one who is there is the one who deserves it. The truth can be delayed, but it can't be erased. No matter how well they perform in the crowd, no matter how long they hide it, the truth will always find a way to be revealed. And when it appears, It doesn't need to shout. It has enough power to shatter all lies. Never compromise your values for a one-sided relationship. If you're always the one calling first, caring first, sacrificing first, that's not family. It's an obligation you're forcing yourself to bear. And most importantly, presence is always more valuable than words. Not "I love you," but "I'm there when you need me." Not "family is everything," but "I'm here when everything falls apart." If you've ever been hurt by your own family, if you've ever been left behind in the most important moments, remember this: you haven't lost your family. You're just seeing clearly who they are. And if this story makes you think, leave a comment. What does family really mean to you? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow true stories, where the truth is told and those who were once silent are finally heard.